The unexpected flight. Keanu Reeves had always been a man who preferred humility over luxury, kindness over entitlement, and respect over power. Despite being one of Hollywood's most beloved and successful actors, he never let his status define him. He flew commercial whenever possible, stood in line like everyone else, and never demanded special treatment. On this particular day, he was traveling from New York to Los Angeles after attending a small independent film premiere. It was meant to be a quiet flight, just a chance for him to relax, read a book, and enjoy some solitude before heading back to work. He had a VIP first-class seat, which had been prearranged by his assistant. Keanu never really cared for such privileges, but his team often ensured he was comfortable on long flights, especially given his grueling schedule. As he approached the boarding gate, Keanu noticed the usual murmurs of recognition. People whispered to one another, some sneaking glances, and a few even bravely approached him for a quick handshake or selfie. He greeted them all with a warm smile, never turning down a moment to connect with fans who appreciated him for more than just his on-screen performances. The gate agent finally announced that it was time for first-class passengers to board. Keanu slung his backpack over his shoulder and made his way toward the entrance, handing over his boarding pass. The flight attendant scanned his ticket, glanced up, and hesitated. "Mr. Reeves," she said, clearing her throat, "there's been a slight change to your seating arrangement." Keanu raised an eyebrow, but remained calm. "Oh." The flight attendant shifted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact. "Yes, sir. There's been a last-minute request from another VIP passenger. We had to move you to accommodate them." A few nearby passengers overheard the exchange and began murmuring. Keanu noticed the way the attendant seemed nervous, almost as if she knew that what she was doing wasn't right. "Who requested the seat change?" he asked, his voice still polite but firm. The attendant hesitated again, clearly debating whether to answer. Finally, she sighed. "A high-priority passenger, Mr. Chambers." Keanu's jaw clenched slightly. He didn't know who Mr. Chambers was, nor did he care. But what bothered him wasn't the seat change itself. It was the way it was handled. "Where am I being moved?" he asked. The attendant gestured toward a standard economy class seat in the middle row, far from the quiet comfort of first class. Keanu looked past her and saw a wealthy-looking white man settling into the seat that had been originally assigned to him. He was already adjusting his expensive watch, flipping through a menu, acting as if nothing unusual had happened. Keanu took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "You're saying that because Mr. Chambers wanted my seat, I'm being sent to economy." The attendant looked increasingly uncomfortable. She knew the situation was unfair. She knew that if this were any other first-class passenger, the airline wouldn't have dared to make such a switch. But Keanu wasn't just any passenger. He was quiet. He was kind. And they had assumed he wouldn't make a scene. The moment hung in the air. The nearby passengers fell completely silent, waiting to see how Keanu would react. He didn't yell. He didn't demand his seat back. Instead, he simply smiled. "Tell me," he said, his voice as calm as ever, "is this standard airline policy? To bump one paying passenger in favor of another based on status?" The flight attendant hesitated. "Well, no, but certain high-profile passengers." "Certain high-profile passengers," Keanu repeated, tilting his head. "And what does that make me?" The question hung in the air, loaded with implications. The flight attendant swallowed. She had no answer. That's when a quiet but firm voice from behind Keanu cut through the silence. "This isn't right." Keanu turned, and to his genuine surprise, he saw that it was another passenger standing up for him. A black woman in her mid-40s, dressed in a sharp business suit, stood with her arms crossed, her expression filled with disapproval. "You're telling me that one of the most respected actors in the world just got booted out of his seat because someone else decided they were more important?" she asked, looking directly at the flight attendant. The flight attendant visibly tensed. "Ma'am, we're just following protocol," she replied, her voice weaker now. The woman scoffed. Whose protocol? The kind that says a rich white man's comfort matters more than fairness. At this point, several more passengers started chiming in. This is discrimination. That's ridiculous. He paid for his ticket. Keanu, just take my seat, man. You shouldn't be treated like this. The tension escalated fast. Keanu wasn't angry, but he was disappointed. He had spent his whole life treating people with respect, regardless of who they were. Yet here he was, being cast aside simply because someone assumed he wouldn't fight back. Look, he said, exhaling deeply. I'm not trying to cause trouble. But if this is how the airline treats people, I think it's worth a conversation. And then he made a call. The passengers watched as he took out his phone, scrolled through his contacts, and dialed a number. The flight attendant stiffened, realizing something big was about to happen. Hey, John, Keanu said as soon as the call connected. I need a favor. Can you check on a certain airline's treatment of passengers? The silence in the cabin was so thick you could hear a pin drop. John was not just a friend. He was one of the biggest investors in the airline. As Keanu spoke, the lead flight attendant suddenly looked panicked. She hurried over, whispering something to the staff. Within seconds, everything changed. The captain himself came out of the cockpit. His face was pale, and he looked deeply apologetic. Mr. Reeves, he said quickly, there's been a terrible misunderstanding. Please, accept our deepest apologies. We insist that you take back your original seat. Keanu paused for a long moment. Then he turned to the woman who had stood up for him and gestured toward the first-class seat. Ma'am, why don't you take my seat instead? He said with a warm smile. I'll take yours in business class. The woman blinked, shocked. I couldn't. You absolutely can, Keanu said, still smiling. You spoke up for what was right. You deserve to be comfortable, too. A round of applause broke out in the cabin. The airline staff had no choice but to comply. The flight took off as scheduled, but not before a full internal investigation was launched by the airline's corporate office. By the time Keanu landed in Los Angeles, the entire team responsible for the discrimination had been fired. Because no matter how famous or powerful someone is, respect is something that should never be optional. The fallout begins. As the plane soared through the sky, Keanu Reeves sat in his newly assigned business class seat, quietly flipping through the worn pages of an old paperback novel. His mind, however, wasn't focused on the words in front of him. Instead, he replayed the events that had just unfolded at the gate. He wasn't angry. Disappointed, yes, but anger was never his first response. He had spent a lifetime observing how people wielded power, sometimes fairly, sometimes unjustly. Today had been a reminder that entitlement and arrogance still thrived in places where they shouldn't. But what he hadn't expected was the ripple effect of his quiet protest. Across the aisle, the black businesswoman who had spoken up for him sat in first class. Every now and then, she would steal a glance at him, still in disbelief that he had given up his seat for her. Her name was Michelle Anderson, a well-known civil rights attorney who had spent her entire career fighting for people who had been overlooked, dismissed, or treated unfairly. As the flight attendant came around with drinks, Michelle leaned over. You didn't have to do that, you know. Keanu smiled, setting his book down. I know. She studied him for a moment, then exhaled. I've seen this kind of thing before. They would have never dared try that with someone who fit their idea of a proper first-class passenger. I couldn't stay quiet. Keanu nodded slowly. And that's exactly why you should be up there. Michelle chuckled, shaking her head. You're something else, Keanu Reeves. Just as she was about to say something else, the flight intercom crackled to life. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're currently cruising at 35,000 feet, and our estimated arrival time in Los Angeles remains unchanged. We appreciate your patience and look forward to a smooth flight. Keanu closed his book, settling deeper into his seat. But just as he did, he noticed something unusual. Two flight attendants whispering to one another near the service area. One of them kept glancing in his direction, her face pale. Something was happening. The call that changed everything. While Keanu had been making his call at the gate, news of the incident had already reached the higher-ups at the airline. John, the airline's major investor and Keanu's longtime friend, didn't waste a second. As soon as he received the call, he contacted the CEO of the airline. The conversation was brief, but the consequences were swift. John didn't need to raise his voice. He simply asked why one of Hollywood's most respected actors had been treated like an inconvenience. He inquired whether the airline's protocol included bumping passengers based on how important they looked. The CEO had no answers, only apologies. By the time Keanu's flight had left the ground, a full-scale investigation had been launched. Senior airline executives had already been briefed, and an emergency meeting was scheduled at corporate headquarters. The employees responsible, including the gate agent and the flight attendants involved in the seat reassignment, were about to receive the shock of their lives. Back on the plane, Keanu was still unaware of how quickly the situation was unraveling for those responsible. A confession at 35,000 feet. The plane had been in the air for about an hour when a nervous-looking flight attendant approached Keanu's seat. She was young, maybe in her mid-20s, and she looked like she was holding her breath. "Mr. Reeves," she said hesitantly. Keanu glanced up from his book, offering her a polite smile. "Yes. I just wanted to say that I'm sorry for what happened earlier." Keanu set his book aside, giving her his full attention. "It's okay," he said, his voice gentle. "It wasn't your fault." The attendant swallowed hard. It was wrong. The truth is, the seat reassignment wasn't because of any official policy. It was because Mr. Chambers, she paused, lowering her voice, paid the gate agent to move you. Keanu's expression didn't change, but his jaw tightened slightly. He had suspected as much. "I overheard them talking before takeoff," the attendant continued, glancing around nervously. "Chambers didn't want to sit next to a celebrity," he said, and I quote, "I don't want to deal with that circus." He told the gate agent to move him somewhere else, and then he slipped her some cash. Keanu exhaled through his nose. He had encountered arrogance before, but the sheer entitlement never ceased to amaze him. The flight attendant looked close to tears. I should have spoken up. I didn't want to lose my job." Keanu's voice was soft but firm. "You're speaking up now. That matters." The flight attendant nodded quickly, relief washing over her face. She hadn't expected kindness. She had expected him to be angry. But Keanu Reeves wasn't that kind of person. What he was, however, was someone who believed in accountability. And as the flight continued, accountability was exactly what was coming. A reckoning awaits. By the time the plane began its descent into Los Angeles, the fallout had already begun. At the airline's corporate headquarters, executives were scrambling. The press had caught wind of the situation, thanks to an anonymous tip from a passenger who had recorded the entire exchange at the gate. Social media was already buzzing with outrage. #respect for Keanu was trending. The airline's public relations team was in full crisis mode, desperately trying to get ahead of the story. But it was too late. John, the investor Keanu had called, had made his position very clear. If heads didn't roll, he would personally ensure that the airline faced major financial consequences. As the plane touched down in Los Angeles, Keanu's phone vibrated with a message from John. "It's done. The entire team responsible. Gone." Keanu leaned back in his seat, exhaling slowly. Justice had been served. But more than that, he hoped this incident would serve as a lesson, not just for those who had been fired, but for anyone who thought they could get away with treating people unfairly. Because power didn't lie in money. It lay in doing the right thing. And for Keanu Reeves, that was the only thing that ever truly mattered. The aftermath unfolds. The moment Keanu Reeves stepped off the plane, the weight of what had transpired followed him like an unshakable shadow. The cool Los Angeles night air hit his face, a stark contrast to the heated situation that had unraveled mid-flight. He pulled his phone from his pocket, scrolling through the numerous missed calls and messages from his close friends and business associates. But it wasn't the calls from Hollywood executives or fellow actors that caught his attention. It was the rapidly growing online storm. By the time his feet touched the polished airport floors, the story had already gone viral. A blurry video taken by a passenger at the gate had surfaced, capturing the humiliating moment when Keanu was asked to switch seats for a wealthier, white businessman. The video showed the entitled gate agent smirking, the hurried exchange of money, and the uncomfortable expressions of other passengers who had witnessed it unfold in real time. And of course, it showed Keanu, calm, composed, gracious as always, but that didn't change the injustice of what had happened. The internet was in an uproar. Keanu exhaled slowly, staring at the message. It wasn't about making things right for him. It was about ensuring no one else had to go through this again. He typed his response carefully before hitting send. Tell them I'll meet, but not for me. For the people who don't have a voice. He put his phone away, adjusting his jacket as he stepped into the night. Because sometimes real change didn't happen in boardrooms. It happened when people like him stood up for the ones who couldn't. The meeting that changed everything. The next morning, the corporate offices of the airline were in full crisis mode. The conference room on the top floor, typically a place where routine financial reports were reviewed, now felt like a pressure cooker of nervous tension. Executives in tailored suits whispered among themselves, their faces pale as they refreshed their phones for updates. At the head of the table sat Richard Caldwell, the airline's CEO, his expression unreadable. He had been in the business for decades, navigating scandals, lawsuits, and market crashes. But nothing like this. This wasn't a PR crisis they could sweep under the rug. Keanu Reeves wasn't just any celebrity. He was a symbol of kindness, humility, and justice, and the internet had already deemed the airline guilty. At exactly 10:00 a.m., the double doors of the boardroom swung open. Keanu walked in, dressed simply in his signature black blazer and dark jeans. No bodyguards, no lawyers, no entourage, just himself, exuding a quiet authority that made the room fall silent. Richard stood up immediately, forcing a tight-lipped smile. Mr. Reeves, thank you for coming. Keanu didn't bother with small talk. He pulled out a chair, took a seat, and met Richard's gaze with a calm yet piercing stare. Let's get to the point. The CEO swallowed. We deeply regret the way you were treated on our flight. We've already terminated the employees responsible, and we'd like to offer a formal public apology, as well as a private settlement for your experience. Keanu leaned back slightly. Settlement. The word lingered in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. This wasn't about money, and they knew it. He let out a slow breath before speaking. Let me ask you something, Richard. His voice was measured, unwavering. If this had happened to someone else, someone without a name, without status, would they have gotten this meeting? The CEO hesitated. Keanu's jaw tensed. That was all the answer he needed. I appreciate the apology, he continued, but I'm not here for me. I'm here because I know this wasn't an isolated incident. How many other passengers have been treated like this? Silence. The PR director shifted uncomfortably in her seat. We assure you, Mr. Reeves, we take all customer complaints seriously. Keanu cut her off. Then prove it. The executives glanced at each other, unsure what he meant. Fire one team, and another will take their place, Keanu said. This isn't just about a few bad employees. It's about your entire culture. The way you handle discrimination, the way you treat people who don't fit a certain profile of what a first-class passenger should look like. Richard exhaled sharply. What are you suggesting? Keanu folded his hands on the table, his voice steady. You implement real change, a diversity and inclusion initiative, mandatory sensitivity training for all employees, especially your frontline staff. And I don't mean a performative PowerPoint presentation. I mean real, immersive, interactive training, the kind that makes people understand the weight of their words and actions. The executive stared, stunned. Keanu wasn't just asking for an apology. He was demanding systemic change. Richard leaned forward, his fingers tapping against the mahogany table. "Do you realize how much that would cost?" Keanu's lips curved into a small smile. "Less than the amount you're losing from boycotts and canceled contracts." A tense silence followed. Linda, the PR director, adjusted her glasses and cleared her throat. "If we were to move forward with something like this, would you be willing to work with us?" Keanu met her gaze, considering. "I don't need my name attached to this. This isn't about my image. It's about doing the right thing." Richard studied him for a long moment, then slowly nodded. "We'll draft a proposal." Keanu stood, signaling that the conversation was over. "Good." Before leaving, he turned back to the CEO. "One more thing." Richard raised an eyebrow. Keanu's voice was softer now, but just as firm. "I was lucky. I had a voice, and people listened. But next time, it might be someone who doesn't. Make sure there isn't a next time." With that, he walked out, leaving behind a room full of powerful people who had just been forced to rethink everything. A ripple effect across the world. By the time Keanu returned home, news of the meeting had already leaked. Headlines flashed across every major outlet. Airline CEO holds emergency meeting with Keanu Reeves following racial discrimination scandal. Keanu Reeves declines settlement, demands real change instead. Airline announces mandatory inclusion training after backlash. Social media was on fire. People weren't just praising Keanu for standing up for himself. They were demanding similar changes from other companies. Imagine if all celebrities used their platform for something meaningful like this. This isn't just about one airline. It's about the everyday racism that happens to people without power. Keanu Reeves is one of the real ones. Within days, multiple airlines had announced new diversity initiatives. Corporations that had previously ignored similar complaints were now scrambling to address their policies. Because if an A-list Hollywood star could be treated this way, then what about the rest of the world? Keanu had started a movement without even trying, and as he sat in his quiet living room, sipping a cup of black coffee, he couldn't help but smile. Because real change had nothing to do with headlines or fame. It had everything to do with making sure the next person never had to experience what he did. And in that moment, he knew. This was bigger than him. The aftermath and the unseen consequences. The weeks following Keanu Reeves' intervention were unlike anything the airline industry had ever seen. The airline's board had no choice but to take swift action. Their entire executive team held emergency meetings. Legal advisors were called in, and PR specialists scrambled to contain the fallout before it could spiral into a full-blown industry crisis. Every major news outlet was covering the scandal. The airline had already announced their intention to implement diversity training and overhaul their customer service policies, but the damage to their reputation was undeniable. Customers were canceling flights, investors were raising concerns, and public trust was at an all-time low. Despite the chaos, Keanu had remained silent. He had done what he came to do. He had forced change in a place that needed it most. But while the world was focused on the drama unfolding at corporate headquarters, something far more important was happening on the ground. It started with a quiet change at the airport itself. A shift in the terminal. At LAX Airport, employees were called in for an emergency training session. For the first time in the airline's history, every staff member, from flight attendants to gate agents, was required to participate in a comprehensive racial sensitivity and customer service training program. This wasn't just a half-hearted PR move. The trainers were real experts, social justice advocates, former victims of discrimination, and even passengers who had experienced unjust treatment firsthand. The sessions were raw, unfiltered, and for many employees, deeply uncomfortable. One of those employees was Melissa Parker. Melissa had been working as a gate agent for over 10 years. She wasn't a bad person. She followed the rules, she did her job. And she never really thought much about who got upgraded and who didn't. To her, it was just company policy. But as she sat in that training session, listening to real stories of passengers who had been discriminated against simply because of their race, their gender, or their background, something inside her shifted. She thought about all the times she had unknowingly upheld policies that benefited some passengers while hurting others. She thought about the countless times she had automatically assumed a well-dressed white man in a suit belonged in first class, while she had questioned Black or Latino passengers who approached her desk. She had never meant to discriminate, but intentions didn't matter. What mattered was who she had hurt. As the session ended, Melissa found herself deep in thought. For the first time in her career, she was beginning to see things clearly. And she wasn't the only one. An unexpected encounter. A few days later, Melissa was back at work, standing at the check-in counter. A long line of passengers had formed, and she was scanning through names, checking luggage, and printing boarding passes as usual. But something about today felt different. And then it happened. A young Black woman walked up to her counter, carrying a small backpack and looking nervous. She handed Melissa her ID and ticket. Melissa's fingers froze over the keyboard. She had seen this woman before. The name on the ticket confirmed it. This was the same passenger who had been asked to move seats the day Keanu Reeves had intervened. Melissa's throat tightened. She remembered how helpless the woman had looked that day, how she had quietly complied, even though she had paid for her first-class seat. Melissa took a deep breath. This was her chance to make things right. She looked up and smiled warmly. "Ms. Carter, we're delighted to have you flying with us today. I see you've been booked in economy, but I'd like to upgrade you to first class at no charge." The woman's eyes widened in surprise. "Really? But I didn't request an upgrade." Melissa nodded, her voice gentle. "It's on the house." For the first time since she had entered the airport, the woman relaxed. She wasn't being questioned. She wasn't being treated differently. She was simply being treated like she belonged. Melissa printed the new ticket and handed it to her, smiling. "Enjoy your flight." As the woman walked away, Melissa felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Pride. For the first time, she had done the right thing without being forced to. And as she watched the woman disappear into the crowd, she silently thanked Keanu Reeves. The ripple effect. Keanu never expected to hear about what happened at the airport that day. But a few weeks later, he received a message. It was a simple email from a passenger named Jasmine Carter. She had been the woman asked to move that day. She had read about everything that had happened after he spoke up. She had seen the firings, the policy changes, the public apologies, and she had witnessed firsthand how those changes had already started affecting people like her. "Mr. Reeves," the email read, "I just wanted to say thank you. I don't know if you even remember me, but I was the passenger they asked to switch seats. You spoke up for me when I didn't have the courage to. I didn't fight back that day. I just let it happen. But because of you, things are already different. Yesterday, when I checked into my flight, they upgraded me without me even asking. Not because I was a celebrity or someone important, just because they wanted to do the right thing. I never thought something like that would happen to me. Thank you for making them see us." Keanu stared at the email for a long moment. He hadn't expected this. He had never needed recognition. But reading those words, he felt something deeper than pride. He felt hope. Change wasn't just a press release or a PR stunt. It was happening. One person at a time. Keanu leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. He had only wanted to call out injustice. Instead, he had started something far bigger. And maybe, just maybe, the world was finally beginning to understand. The unfinished fight. The world had already seen the headlines. Keanu Reeves calls out airline discrimination. Company fires entire team. The scandal had gripped social media, news outlets, and late-night talk shows for weeks. Everyone had an opinion on it. Some praised the airline for making sweeping changes, while others argued that it was merely damage control. But in the midst of all this, there was one man who had lost everything. someone no one was talking about. Mark Evans, the regional manager responsible for the first-class seating arrangements that day, was one of the employees who had been fired in the aftermath. Unlike the gate agents who had simply followed orders, Mark had made the call. He had been the one who insisted that the important client should be given Keanu Reeves' seat, while the black woman in first class should be asked to move. When the scandal broke, his name wasn't released to the public, but within the industry, he was a pariah. His LinkedIn account was flooded with angry messages. People he had worked with for over a decade stopped returning his calls. Job applications went unanswered. Even rival airlines refused to touch him. He had become the face of corporate racism, and now no one wanted to be associated with him. At first, he had been defensive. He wasn't a racist, he told himself. He was just doing his job. He had seen dozens of seat switches before, and it was always about customer priority, not race. But the more he thought about it, the harder it became to justify. Because deep down, he knew the truth. If it had been a wealthy white businessman sitting in that seat instead of a black woman, he never would have even considered asking him to move. And if Keanu Reeves had been dressed in an expensive designer suit that day instead of his casual clothes, he never would have been treated as expendable. Mark sat in his apartment, staring at his laptop screen. He had spent the last 2 months trying to rebuild his career, but no one wanted to give him a second chance. But then, something unexpected happened. A notification popped up on his screen. An invitation, an unlikely meeting. The email was from a law firm that specialized in corporate diversity and inclusion cases. At first, he thought it was some sort of lawsuit, but then he read the subject line again. Would you be open to a conversation? The firm wasn't looking to sue him. They were looking to hire him. Confused, Mark agreed to the meeting. 2 days later, he walked into a sleek office in downtown Los Angeles. A woman named Dr. Lisa Caldwell, an expert in racial equity, greeted him with a firm handshake. You probably weren't expecting this, she said, offering him a seat. Mark nodded, still unsure what was happening. Why would a diversity firm want to hire someone like him? Dr. Caldwell sat across from him and leaned forward. You made a mistake, Mark. A big one. But what matters is what you do now. The world doesn't need another fired executive pretending they didn't do anything wrong. What the world needs is someone who actually learns from their mistakes. Mark swallowed hard. I don't even know where to start. Dr. Caldwell slid a thick folder across the table. Start here. Mark opened it. Inside was a new proposal. A corporate training initiative, designed by the very people who had once been victims of the same discrimination he had enforced. And if he accepted, he wouldn't just be attending it. He would be helping lead it. The hardest decision of his life. That night, Mark sat on his couch, staring at the folder. He had 2 choices. He could continue living in denial, blaming cancel culture, blaming Keanu Reeves, blaming everyone but himself. Or he could face reality. He could acknowledge the harm he had done. He could step into the uncomfortable space of accountability. And so, for the first time in his life, he made the right choice. He picked up his phone and dialed the number at the bottom of the folder. Dr. Caldwell, he said, his voice steady. I'm in. An unexpected phone call. Meanwhile, Keanu Reeves was sitting in a cafe, completely unaware of the ripple effect he had created. His assistant handed him a phone. You got an interesting message. Keanu raised an eyebrow. Who from? His assistant smirked. Mark Evans. Keanu almost didn't believe it. Mark Evans? The same man who had made the discriminatory decision. The same man who had been fired because of it. He wants to talk. Keanu took a deep breath. Tell him I'll listen. The call that changed everything. The phone call between Keanu Reeves and Mark Evans was something neither of them expected to happen. One was a world-famous actor known for his kindness and humility, while the other was a disgraced airline executive, now trying to piece his life back together after a decision that cost him everything. Keanu wasn't sure what to expect when he answered. Would Mark try to justify himself? Would he apologize? Or was this just another attempt to shift the blame onto someone else? Mark, on the other hand, was terrified. He had never spoken to Keanu before, not directly. During the whole scandal, he had been focused on damage control, on trying to save himself. But now, there was nothing left to save except his integrity. There was a long silence before Keanu finally spoke. "So, you wanted to talk?" Mark took a deep breath. "Yeah, I did. And I don't really know where to start." Keanu leaned back in his chair, keeping his voice calm but firm. "How about you start with the truth?" Mark swallowed hard. "The truth is, I messed up." He hesitated before continuing. "I didn't think about it at the time, but I made a decision based on biases I didn't even realize I had. I looked at you, and I saw someone who didn't fit in first class. I looked at the woman next to you, and I assumed she was less important than the person who asked for the seat." Keanu didn't respond right away. He had heard apologies before, ones that were forced, ones that were performative. But something about Mark's tone felt different. It wasn't rehearsed. It wasn't defensive. It was real. "Why are you telling me this now?" Keanu finally asked. Mark sighed. "Because I'd finally understand what I did, and I don't want my entire life to be defined by one mistake. I want to do something to fix it." Keanu let the words settle. Accountability was rare in the world Mark came from. Most people in his position would have blamed the system, blamed their boss, blamed woke culture. But here he was, admitting it. "So what now?" Keanu asked. "You lost your job, your reputation, and your industry blacklisted you. What do you want from me?" Mark hesitated before answering. "I don't want anything from you. I just want to make things right. I've been working with a team that focuses on diversity training. They want to change how people like me, people in decision-making positions, see the world. I want to be part of that change." Keanu exhaled, running a hand through his hair. This was unexpected. But at the same time, it was exactly what needed to happen. Real change wasn't just about firing people. It was about making sure they understood why what they did was wrong, and making sure it didn't happen again. After a long pause, Keanu finally said, "All right, tell me more." The beginning of something bigger. Over the next few weeks, Mark started working directly with Dr. Lisa Caldwell's team. They built a program that didn't just focus on generic corporate training, but on real-world scenarios, moments where bias, discrimination, and systemic racism played out in everyday decisions, often without people even realizing it. Mark became the face of change, openly talking about his own mistakes in interviews, corporate meetings, and even university lectures. Instead of hiding from what he had done, he used it to teach others. The airline industry took notice. If one of their own could admit he was wrong, what did that say about the others who had remained silent? It didn't take long before other companies started reaching out. Luxury hotels, private clubs, investment firms. All industries where people of color were often treated differently, subtly excluded, or judged based on appearance. Mark wasn't asking for sympathy. He wasn't asking for forgiveness. He was asking people to do better. An unexpected invitation. One day, Keanu received a call from an unknown number. "Mr. Reeves, we'd like to invite you to an event. It's about the impact your story had on changing corporate bias." Keanu, who rarely attended these kinds of things, wasn't sure if he wanted to go. He didn't do this for the recognition. He had only spoken up because he saw something wrong, and he refused to stay silent. But then he heard the next part. "Mark Evans will be there too." That caught his attention. Keanu had been following Mark's journey from a distance. He had seen the interviews, the speeches, the changes happening within the airline industry. He had seen a man who had once dismissed him as unimportant turn into someone fighting to make sure it never happened again. So, after a brief pause, Keanu finally said, "I'll be there." The moment of truth. The event was held in a sleek, modern conference hall filled with executives, activists, and corporate leaders. At the front of the room, a large screen displayed the words, "Redefining Inclusion. Lessons from the Keanu Reeves flight incident." Keanu sat quietly at a table near the back, listening as different speakers took the stage. Then it was Mark's turn. He walked up to the microphone, his posture straighter than it had been months ago, his voice steady. "I was the man who made the call that day. I was the one who looked at two passengers and decided, without even thinking, that one was more valuable than the other." The room was silent. I could stand here and tell you that it wasn't about race, that it was just a mistake, but that would be a lie. Because the truth is, if the roles had been reversed, if the white passenger had been sitting where Keanu Reeves was sitting, I wouldn't have asked them to move. And that's the problem. A murmur swept through the audience. I was part of the problem. And now I want to be part of the solution. Keanu watched as Mark spoke openly about his biases, about the changes he was helping implement in major corporations. He saw a man who had gone from defensive and angry to self-aware and driven. And for the first time since that flight, Keanu finally felt like something good had come out of it all. A personal conversation. After the event, Mark walked up to Keanu. There was a brief, tense silence before he finally spoke. "I don't expect forgiveness," Mark said. "I just wanted to thank you. If you hadn't stood up that day, I don't think I ever would have realized how blind I was." Keanu studied him for a moment before extending his hand. "It's not about forgiveness. It's about what you do next." Mark took his hand and shook it. And with that, they parted ways, not as enemies, not as friends, but as two men who had been on opposite sides of a problem, and now stood on the same side of a solution. The legacy of a moment. The airline industry, under pressure from the public and advocacy groups, rolled out new policies. Bias training became mandatory. First-class seating policies were revised. Executives were forced to confront the uncomfortable truths about who they prioritized and why. And at the heart of it all was one simple moment. A moment where a man in casual clothes was asked to move and refused to be treated as less than. Keanu never expected to change the world that day. But he did. And so did Mark. Because real change isn't about one person. It's about the choices we make when we know better.